Close your eyes and imagine a landscape of extraordinary quietness. It is the late 13th century. The world is vast and largely unmapped. Somewhere in the rolling highlands of northwestern Anatolia, where the air smells of wild thyme and dry earth, where the wind moves slowly through groves of oak and pine, a small group of people are making their home on the margins of something much larger than themselves. They are nomads or the children of nomads, and their world is the saddle, the tent, the fire at night, and the slow movement of seasons across open land. They call themselves the Kei, a branch of the Oghuz Turks, and they have wandered for generations across the great steppes of Central Asia, pushed westward by the trembling of empires, the collapse of kingdoms, and the slow pressure of history. Their leader is an old man named Ertugrul. He is weathered and quiet, a man who knows the silence of mountains and the patience required to survive on difficult land. He has brought his people far, and now, on the edge of the Byzantine world, on the borderlands where Christian civilization begins to thin and blur, he has found a place to rest. His son is a young man named Osman. Osman is not yet famous. He is not yet anything except a young man with bright eyes and large ambitions, and the particular energy of someone who believes, deeply and without doubt, that the world is about to change. He is right. What Osman will build from this quiet corner of Anatolia will become one of the longest-lasting and most powerful empires the world has ever known. It will stretch at its height across 3 continents. It will govern millions of people speaking dozens of languages. It will produce art of breathtaking beauty, architecture of impossible grandeur, poetry of aching delicacy. It will absorb the remnants of Rome, the inheritance of Persia, the wisdom of the Arab world. It will rise slowly, slowly over centuries, and it will fall slowly too, leaving behind a world that still carries its fingerprints. But all of that is later. For now, it is simply a cold night in Anatolia, and a young man named Osman is lying on his back looking up at the stars. Let us begin. The Dream of Osman. Chapter 1: The World Before. To understand the Ottoman Empire, we must first understand the world into which it was born, and that world was one of extraordinary turbulence. The 13th century was an age of catastrophe. From the east, the Mongols had swept across Asia and into the heart of the Islamic world with a ferocity that left contemporaries speechless. In 1258, Hulagu Khan and his armies had descended upon Baghdad, the jeweled city of the Abbasid Caliphate, the center of Islamic civilization, the city of libraries and scholars and philosophers and poets. They had torn it apart with methodical violence. The canals ran dark with ink from the books thrown into the Tigris. The Caliph himself was killed. The world that had existed for 5 centuries, the world of Islamic learning centered on that great city, was simply gone. To the west, the Crusades had fractured the relationship between the Christian and Islamic worlds, creating wounds that would take centuries to heal, or perhaps never heal at all. The Byzantine Empire, once the dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean, had been shattered by the Fourth Crusade in 1204, its capital Constantinople sacked by its fellow Christians, its territories fragmented and contested. Anatolia, the great landmass that bridges Europe and Asia, was a patchwork of small powers. The Seljuk Sultanate of Rum had once governed much of it from the city of Konya, but after the Mongol invasions, the Sultanate too had fractured and weakened. In its place, a collection of small Turkish principalities, the Beyliks, had emerged across the landscape, each one carving out its own small domain in the confusion. Osman's people were one of these principalities, small, peripheral, easily overlooked. But geography, as so often in history, would prove decisive. The Kei tribe had been settled near the Byzantine frontier. This meant that unlike the more eastern Beyliks, they had no Mongol masters directly above them demanding tribute and submission. They were, in a sense, free and hungry for land, and positioned directly on the edge of a world that was slowly, year by year, becoming easier to enter. Byzantium was weakening. Its border defenses had grown thin and sparse. The great walls and garrison towns that had once held back centuries of invaders were crumbling, understaffed, demoralized. The farmers and peasants of the Byzantine frontier were exhausted by taxation and neglect. Osman saw an opportunity. Chapter 2: The Legend of the Dream. Every great dynasty needs its founding myth. The story that would come to define the Ottoman centers on a dream. As the legend tells it, the young Osman was staying as a guest in the home of a holy man, a dervish named Sheikh Edibali, a man of learning and spiritual authority whom Osman deeply respected. During the night, Osman had a dream of extraordinary vividness. Dream: a moon rose from the chest of the holy man and descended into Osman's own chest. From his navel, a great tree began to grow, spreading its branches until it covered the entire world. Beneath its shade, mountains rose at its roots: the Caucasus, the Atlas, the Balkans, and the Taurus ranges. From these mountains flowed 4 great rivers: the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Nile, and the Danube. Across the land, countless cities gleamed, and over all of them the crescent and the star shone in the sky. When Osman awoke and described the dream to Sheikh Edibali, the holy man interpreted it as a prophecy. Osman and his descendants were destined to rule a vast empire. And as a sign of this destiny, the sheikh gave Osman his daughter Malhun in marriage. Whether this dream actually occurred, whether it was embroidered by later court historians, or whether it was invented entirely as a legitimizing narrative, we cannot know for certain. What we know is that the story was told and retold, that it became central to Ottoman identity, that it gave the dynasty a sense of divine mission that would carry them through centuries of expansion and adversity. The dream of a tree that covers the world. It is, in its way, a beautiful image. And there is something appropriate about the fact that the Ottoman story begins with a dream, because the empire itself would come to feel, to many who lived within it and beyond it, like something vast and strange, and almost impossible to fully comprehend. A dream of civilization that lasted 600 years. Chapter 3: The Early Campaigns. Osman was not a dreamer in the passive sense. He was a man of action, shrewd and patient and capable of sudden decisive movement. His early campaigns were raids, largely. The Turkish principalities of Anatolia sustained themselves partly through Gaza, the tradition of raiding against non-Muslim territories. It was both economically profitable and spiritually sanctioned. Warriors who participated in Gaza were Ghazis, holy warriors in the Islamic tradition, and the tradition attracted adventurers, displaced soldiers, and restless young men from across the Muslim world. Osman's raids against Byzantine territory began to produce results. Small towns fell. Farmers pledged their loyalty or fled. The gradual absorption of Byzantine borderland settlements gave Osman land to distribute, resources to collect, and followers to reward. The key moment came in 1301 at the Battle of Baphius, near Nicomedia on the Sea of Marmara. A Byzantine force sent to relieve pressure on besieged settlements was met by Osman's troops and decisively defeated. It was a relatively small engagement, but its symbolic importance was enormous. Osman had beaten the army of the greatest Christian empire in the East. News spread. More warriors came to join him. More land became available. Slowly, patiently, year by year, the small domain of the Kei grew. Osman did not live to see the greatest of his conquests. He died around 1323, before his armies would take the city of Bursa, which would become the first true capital of the Ottoman state. But by the time of his death, he had transformed a small nomadic principality into something much more. A structured, organized, expanding state with a clear sense of mission and an identity that would endure. His name would be carried for 6 more centuries by the dynasty he founded, the Osmanli, the Ottomans. Chapter 4: Bursa, the first capital. Bursa fell to Ottoman forces in 1326, shortly after Osman's death. His son Orhan, who had led the siege, entered the city as its new ruler. Bursa was a transformation. It was not a tent city or a collection of seasonal camps. It was an ancient, established city with walls and markets and mosques and bathhouses. It sat at the foot of a great mountain, Uludag, the ancient Mysian Olympus, its slopes forested and cool, its peaks sometimes dusted with snow even in summer. Orhan understood immediately that ruling a city required different skills than raiding on horseback. He would need administrators. He would need laws. He would need institutions. This is perhaps the most remarkable thing about the early Ottomans, their extraordinary adaptability. They were not ideologically rigid. They did not insist on a single way of doing things. When they needed administrators, they hired them. When they needed scholars, they invited them. When they needed a model for governance, they looked at what had worked before and adapted it. Orhan began minting coins, the essential symbol of sovereignty. He began building mosques, emirate soup kitchens for the poor, hand travelers' lodges, medrese schools for scholars. He hired scholars from across the Islamic world to come and teach. He appointed his brother Alauddin as something like a chief minister. And he kept expanding. Northwest across the Sea of Marmara lay the great prize that would obsess every Ottoman sultan for the next century, Constantinople, the city of Constantine, the city of Justinian, the city of the Hagia Sophia, the city that called itself the center of the world. But Constantinople was still very far away, fortified behind walls of such magnificence that no attacker had breached them in nearly 1,000 years. Before Constantinople, there were other targets. Across the waters. Chapter 5. Into Europe. In 1345, the Ottomans crossed into Europe for the first time. The crossing was not a conquest, it was an invitation. The Byzantine Empire was in the midst of one of its periodic civil wars. John VI Cantacuzeno's, fighting for control of the throne, turned to the Ottomans for military assistance. Orhan sent troops. Cantacuzeno's won his throne, and in gratitude he gave Orhan his daughter Theodora in marriage, cementing an alliance between the Ottoman Principality and the Byzantine imperial family. Ottoman troops began crossing the Hellespont, the narrow strait between Asia and Europe, to assist in various Byzantine disputes. They saw, for the first time, the landscape of Thrace, rolling plains stretching away into the Balkans, wealthy cities and fertile farmland, a world of possibility. They would not forget what they had seen. In 1354, an earthquake damaged the walls of the small Thracian city of Gallipoli, and Ottoman troops occupied it before the Byzantines could repair their defenses. This was the first permanent Ottoman foothold in Europe. The Hellespont was now crossable at will. Orhan's son Murad, who became sultan in 1362, understood the magnitude of what lay before him. He moved the administrative center of the growing state from Bursa to Edirne, a city in Thrace much closer to the European frontier. It was a declaration of intention. The Ottomans were not merely raiding across the water. They were coming to stay. Chapter 6. The Balkans open. The Balkans in the 14th century were a political landscape of extraordinary complexity. The old Bulgarian Empire was in decline. Serbia was powerful but fractious, its energies divided between internal politics and external ambitions. Smaller kingdoms and principalities dotted the landscape: Bosnia, Wallachia, Albania. The Byzantine Empire held only Constantinople and a few scattered territories. One by one, the Ottoman armies moved through this landscape. In 1371, at the Battle of Maritsa, a large Serbian and Bulgarian coalition force was destroyed by Ottoman troops. It was a catastrophic defeat for the Christian powers, and news of it sent shockwaves across Europe. More Ottoman advances followed. Bulgaria fell under Ottoman suzerainty. Macedonia was absorbed. Kosovo became the stage for a battle that would echo through history. The Battle of Kosovo in 1389 is one of those events that exists simultaneously as history and as myth. Sultan Murad I led a large Ottoman army against a coalition of Balkan forces led by Lazar of Serbia. The battle was immense, brutal, and in the end decisive. The Ottomans won, though Murad himself was killed, stabbed by a Serbian nobleman named Milos Obilic who had penetrated the Ottoman camp under pretense of surrender. Murad was succeeded immediately on the battlefield by his son Bayezid, who executed his brother on the spot, establishing a practice of fratricide that would become grimly characteristic of Ottoman succession. Bayezid moved quickly, consolidating the gains of the battle, pressing deeper into Bulgarian and Serbian territory. By the end of his reign, most of the Balkans had been brought under Ottoman control or Ottoman suzerainty. Europe was alarmed. Pope Boniface IX called for a crusade. Hungary responded. A large European coalition force assembled and marched south. At Nicopolis in 1396, they met the Ottoman army. It was a disaster for the Crusaders. The French knights, characteristically charged without coordination, broke through the Ottoman front lines and then found themselves surrounded by reserves they had not expected. The battle became a rout, then a massacre. Thousands were killed or captured. The last major crusade against the Ottomans ended in the waters of the Danube. Chapter 7. The Thunderbolt and His World. Bayezid I was called Yildirim, the Thunderbolt, for the speed of his campaigns. He was a man of ferocious energy and considerable military genius. Under his leadership, the Ottoman state expanded dramatically in both Europe and Anatolia. But Bayezid had a problem he could not solve by speed alone. From the east, there came a man whose name was enough to make entire armies turn and flee. Timur, known in the west as Tamerlane, the great conqueror from Samarkand, who had built an empire stretching from Persia to India and was now turning his attention westward. Timur was extraordinary. He was crippled in one leg from a wound received in his youth, and yet he conquered more territory than almost any man who ever lived. He was simultaneously a patron of art and architecture of great sensitivity and a commander who ordered massacres of extraordinary brutality. He was a Muslim who killed millions of Muslims. He was a Turk who defeated Turks. He was a paradox in flesh and armor. Timur regarded Bayezid's growing power with contempt and irritation. The two men exchanged letters of increasing hostility. Timur accused Bayezid of sheltering enemies. Bayezid responded with insults. The correspondence grew more heated. In 1402, near the city of Ankara, the two armies met. The Battle of Ankara was one of the largest battles of the medieval world. Hundreds of thousands of men faced each other across a dusty Anatolian plain, but the outcome was decided in part before the fighting began. Timur had made contact with the Anatolian Turkish vassals who had been forced to submit to Bayezid, and many of them changed sides during the battle. Bayezid's forces collapsed. Bayezid himself was captured. He was the first Ottoman sultan ever taken prisoner by an enemy. The stories of his captivity are numerous and mostly legendary, that he was kept in a cage, that Timur used him as a footstool to mount his horse. These details are probably inventions of later chroniclers, but the humiliation was real. Bayezid died in captivity in 1403. Timur did not try to rule Anatolia. He restored the Anatolian beyliks he had defeated, subdivided Ottoman territory among Bayezid's sons, and then moved on toward other conquests. He died in 1405 on his way to invade China. But the damage to the Ottoman state was severe. For 11 years after Ankara, the sons of Bayezid fought each other in a civil war known as the Ottoman Interregnum. It was a dark period, full of violence and uncertainty, and it might easily have ended the Ottoman enterprise entirely. Chapter 8. The Interregnum and the Revival. 4 of Bayezid's sons contested the throne during the Interregnum: Suleiman, Musa, Issa, and Mehmed. Over 11 years of maneuvering, alliance-making, and outright battle, all were eliminated except Mehmed, who emerged in 1413 as Mehmed I, sole sultan and ruler of a reunified Ottoman state. Mehmed I was a cautious, careful man, temperamentally unlike his fierce and impulsive father. His priority was consolidation, not expansion. He spent his reign repairing the damage of the interregnum, reasserting control over wayward provinces, rebuilding administrative structures, and keeping the peace where possible. His son Murad II continued this work. Murad was a complex figure, a warrior capable of campaigns of great skill, but also a man drawn to contemplation, who twice abdicated the throne in favor of quiet study and twice had to be recalled to deal with crises. He loved poetry and scholarship. He patronized artists and built beautiful mosques. And he gradually, methodically restored Ottoman power in the Balkans and Anatolia. But it was Murad's son who would make the moment that would define the Ottoman Empire forever. The Fall of the City. Chapter 9. The Young Sultan. Mehmed II came to the throne for the first time in 1444, when his father Murad abdicated. He was 12 years old, and the court did not take him seriously. There were intrigues against him almost immediately. Within 2 years, Murad had been called back from retirement to deal with a crisis, and Mehmed had been sent away to the provinces. But Mehmed was watching, Mehmed was learning, and Mehmed was developing an obsession that would define the rest of his life. Constantinople. The city had been the dream of every Ottoman sultan before him. It was the greatest city in the known world, or at least it had been. Centuries of decline had reduced it from a metropolis of 1 million people to a much smaller, hollower version of its former self, its great spaces filled with ruins and gardens where palaces had once stood, its population reduced to perhaps 50,000 people. But its walls were still intact, and its symbolic significance was beyond measure. To take Constantinople would be to inherit Rome. It would give the Ottoman Sultan a claim not merely to Islamic leadership, but to a kind of universal kingship. It would open the Black Sea trade routes. It would eliminate the last remnant of the Byzantine state, which even in its weakness served as a focus for anti-Ottoman sentiment and a potential base for Crusader attacks. And it would fulfill a prophecy. The prophet Muhammad was said to have praised the leader who would conquer Constantinople, a great commander of a great army. Every Ottoman sultan had hoped to be that commander. Mehmed II intended to be. Chapter 10. The Preparations. When Murad II died in 1451, and Mehmed II came to the throne for the second time, he was 19 years old and already certain of what he was going to do. He began preparing immediately. His first move was to secure his rear. He made peace with the Hungarians and the Venetians, at least temporarily. He dealt swiftly and ruthlessly with any potential internal opposition. And then he turned to the practical problem of how to take a city that had never been taken from the outside. The walls of Constantinople were extraordinary. Built by the Emperor Theodosius II in the 5th century, they formed a triple line of defense across the narrow neck of land connecting the city to the European mainland. The outer wall, the inner wall, and a massive inner wall reinforced by towers created a defensive system of almost unimaginable strength. For 1,000 years, armies of Avars, Arabs, Bulgarians, and Rus had hurled themselves at these walls and broken. Mehmed's answer was technology. He commissioned a Hungarian engineer named Urban to build him a cannon unlike any that had ever existed. Urban had offered his services first to the Byzantine emperor, who could not afford him. Mehmed could. The cannon that Urban built for Mehmed was called the Great Bombard. It was approximately 27 feet long and required a team of 60 oxen and hundreds of men to transport. It could fire a stone ball weighing over 1,000 pounds. Nothing in the world had ever fired a projectile so large. Mehmed also built a fortress, Rumeli Hisari, on the European shore of the Bosphorus, just north of Constantinople. Combined with an existing fortress on the Asian side, it allowed him to cut off Constantinople from naval supply from the Black Sea. The city was being strangled before the siege even began. Chapter 11. The Siege. The Ottoman army arrived before the walls of Constantinople in early April 1453. The size of the army is debated, but it was certainly massive. Most historians suggest between 80,000 and 100,000 men. The Byzantine garrison numbered perhaps 7,000, including a few hundred Genoese and Venetian volunteers. The disproportion was extraordinary, but the walls had held against such odds before. For 53 days, the siege continued. The great bombard fired, and sections of the outer wall crumbled. Byzantine defenders worked through the night to fill the gaps with earth and timber. Ottoman assault parties tried and failed to breach the defenses. The Greek fire, the mysterious incendiary weapon that the Byzantines had used for centuries, drove back ships. Ottoman tunnelers dug beneath the walls. Byzantine counterminers found their tunnels and flooded them. Mehmed watched from his red and gold tent, sleepless, intense, utterly focused. There was a moment of near despair when a Venetian relief fleet was reported to be coming. It never arrived. There was a lunar eclipse, which the Byzantines interpreted as a sign of doom. There was a strange light that appeared to hover over the dome of the Hagia Sophia and then move westward, which both sides interpreted according to their hopes and fears. And then, on the night of May 28 to May 29, 1453, everything changed. Chapter 12. The Last Day of Byzantium. The final assault began in the small hours of May 29. Wave after wave of Ottoman troops attacked the walls. The first waves, irregular troops and volunteers, were thrown forward to tire the defenders. The professional Janissary infantry followed. And then a discovery was made, perhaps accidental. A small gate in the wall, the Kirkaporta, had been left unlatched after a sortie by defenders. Ottoman troops poured through. The cry went up, "The city is taken." The defenders broke. The Genoese commander Giustiniani, who had held the walls with extraordinary courage through the entire siege, was wounded and was carried to his ship. The Emperor Constantine Xi Palaiologos, the last Byzantine emperor, took off his imperial regalia so that he would not be recognized and captured and charged into the fighting. He was never seen again. The city was taken. Mehmed II entered Constantinople on horseback on the afternoon of May 29, 1453. According to the custom of the time, he allowed his troops 3 days of pillage. Churches were looted. People were enslaved or killed. The great libraries were scattered. But then Mehmed walked through the ruins to the Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in the Christian world, the golden dome that had stood for 900 years. He entered and stood beneath the great dome, looking up at the mosaics of Christ and the saints, the golden light filtering through high windows. He gave orders. The church was to be converted to a mosque, but it was not to be destroyed. It was to be preserved. The mosaics would be plastered over, not smashed. The building itself would stand. Mehmed understood immediately that he had not simply conquered a city. He had inherited a tradition. He began calling himself Caesari Rum, Caesar of Rome. He brought the patriarch of the Greek Orthodox Church back to Constantinople and gave the church protection under Ottoman rule. He invited Jewish and Armenian communities to settle in his new capital. The Ottoman Empire was not going to be a simple Turkish tribal state. It was going to be something much more complex and much more interesting. The Age of Expansion. Chapter 13. The Conqueror's World. Mehmed II, whom history calls the Conqueror, spent the rest of his reign in almost continuous warfare. He conquered Serbia. He absorbed the last remnant of the Trapezuntine Empire on the Black Sea coast. He invaded the Crimea, making the Crimean Khanate an Ottoman vassal. He conquered Bosnia and Albania, with bitter resistance from the Albanian leader Skanderbeg, who kept the Ottomans at bay for decades through a combination of military skill and sheer determined ferocity. He sent his fleets to raid the coast of Italy. He also governed with intelligence and sophistication. He issued a legal code. He created a complex administrative structure based on the devshirme system, in which Christian boys from the Balkans were taken from their families, converted to Islam, educated at the palace school, and trained to serve as administrators and soldiers. The Janissary Corps, the elite infantry that formed the backbone of the Ottoman army, was drawn from these devshirme boys. This system has sometimes been described as slavery, and in a technical sense it was. But the devshirme boys became something more complicated, the most powerful servants of the Sultan, educated, disciplined, and in many cases rising to the very highest positions in the empire. Grand viziers who effectively governed the empire were often of devshirme origin. It was a system that simultaneously displaced people from their origins and gave them extraordinary opportunities. It is difficult to evaluate by modern moral standards, and perhaps we should not try too hard to do so. Mehmed was also a patron of learning of the First Order. He brought scholars, artists, and scientists to his court. He spoke multiple languages, including Greek, Latin, Persian, Arabic, and Turkish. He commissioned portraits of himself from the Italian painter Gentile Bellini, whose famous portrait shows the conqueror as a man of concentrated, watchful intelligence, a face that gives nothing away. He died in 1481 on the march toward another campaign, aged only 49. The nature of his death was mysterious. Some suspected poison. The army wept. Chapter 14. Selim the Grim. After Mehmed came Bayezid II, a pious and relatively peaceful sultan who consolidated rather than expanded. And after Bayezid came a man of very different temperament, Selim I, known as the Grim, or in Turkish Yavuz, the Stern. Selim came to power in 1512 after forcing his father to abdicate. He was a man of extraordinary violence and extraordinary ability, and he regarded the world as a set of problems to be solved by overwhelming force applied with maximum speed. His first priority was the East. To the east lay the Safavid Empire of Persia, newly established under Shah Ismail, who had adopted Shia Islam as the state religion of Persia and was aggressively promoting it. The Safavids were actively encouraging Shia sentiment among the population of eastern Anatolia, which was potentially destabilizing for the Ottomans. Selim's response was to massacre tens of thousands of Shia Muslims in Anatolia before his eastern campaign, one of the darker chapters in Ottoman history. In 1514, at Chaldiran in northwestern Iran, Selim's army met the Safavid forces. The Ottomans had muskets and artillery. The Safavids had cavalry and courage. The result was a decisive Ottoman victory. The Safavid capital Tabriz was briefly captured. Shah Ismail survived but was never quite the same man afterward. Selim then turned south, toward the Mamluk Sultanate that controlled Egypt and Syria and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. In 1516 and 1517, in swift succession, Selim's armies defeated the Mamluks in Syria and Egypt. Cairo fell. The last Abbasid caliph in Cairo, a purely ceremonial figure maintained by the Mamluks, was taken to Constantinople. The custodianship of the two holy mosques, Mecca and Medina, passed to the Ottoman Sultan. The symbolic dimensions of this were enormous. The Ottoman Sultan was now the protector of the holiest sites of Islam. Selim died in 1520 after only 8 years on the throne, probably from plague or cancer. In those 8 years, he had nearly doubled the size of the empire. Chapter 15. Sulayman. Selim's son was 26 years old when he became sultan. His name was Sulayman. He would be remembered as Sulayman the Magnificent in Europe, and as Sulayman the Lawgiver, Kanuni, in the Ottoman world. He would reign for 46 years, and his reign would represent, in the eyes of most historians, the apex of Ottoman civilization. Sulayman was everything a sultan was supposed to be. He was handsome and grave, with a long face and heavy-lidded eyes that seemed always to be seeing something far away. He was a poet of genuine talent, writing under the pen name Muhibbi, the Beloved. He was a patron of art and architecture on a scale that transformed the physical appearance of his capital. He was a lawgiver who systematically codified Ottoman law, creating a legal framework that would endure for centuries. And he was a military commander of the first rank. In 1521, he took Belgrade, the key fortress that guarded the route into Hungary. In 1522, he took Rhodes from the Knights Hospitaller, ending 3 centuries of Crusader presence in the eastern Mediterranean. In 1526, at the Battle of Mohacs, he destroyed the Hungarian army and killed the Hungarian king. Hungary was absorbed into the Ottoman sphere. In 1529, he marched to the walls of Vienna, the Habsburg capital, and laid siege to it. Vienna did not fall. The siege was lifted after 3 weeks, partly because of supply difficulties and the approach of autumn. But the shock to Europe was profound. The Ottoman army had reached the heart of the continent. No one was safe. Suleiman extended his reach by sea as well. His great admiral, Hayreddin Barbarossa, the formidable corsair from the Aegean who had entered Ottoman service, dominated the Mediterranean, raiding the coasts of Spain and Italy, winning great naval victories, and extending Ottoman naval power to the coasts of North Africa. At his height, Suleiman ruled from the borders of Morocco to the borders of Iran, from the Crimea to Aden, from the Danube to the Nile. More than 20 million people lived under his rule. The world Suleiman built. Chapter 16, The Architect and the Sultan. To understand what Suleiman built, you must understand Mimar Sinan. Sinan was born around 1490, probably in central Anatolia, to a Christian family. He was taken by the Devshirme system, converted, educated, and trained as a military engineer. He served on multiple campaigns and showed such exceptional ability that he was eventually appointed chief architect of the empire, a position he would hold for 50 years. In those 50 years, Sinan designed and built, by his own count, 477 structures: mosques, palaces, schools, bridges, aqueducts, caravanserais, and hospitals. Not all of these survive, and not all were equally significant, but among them were some of the most beautiful buildings ever created by human hands. The Süleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul, completed in 1558, rises above the city on a hill between the Golden Horn and the Sea of Marmara. Its 4 minarets stand like elegant sentinels. Its great dome soars above the interior in a space of extraordinary luminosity, the light pouring through dozens of stained glass windows designed by a master craftsman known as Ibrahim the Drunkard, who produced some of the most beautiful glasswork in the world despite, or perhaps, because of his relationship with wine. But Sinan considered the Süleymaniye only his apprenticeship. His masterwork, he said, was the Selimiye Mosque in Edirne, completed in 1575. Its single dome is wider than that of the Hagia Sophia. Its 8 piers, delicate and widely spaced, create an interior of breathtaking openness. It is a building of mathematical precision and aesthetic grace that can still stop a visitor in their tracks, centuries later. Sinan died in 1588, approximately 98 years old. The buildings he left behind are among the greatest contributions to world architecture. Chapter 17, The Harem and the Heart of Power. No aspect of Ottoman civilization has attracted more Western fascination and generated more Western misunderstanding than the imperial harem. The word harem comes from the Arabic haram, meaning forbidden or sacred. The imperial harem was the private household of the sultan, containing his mother, his sisters, his concubines, his children, and the female staff who served them. Entry was restricted to the sultan himself and the eunuchs who served as guards and administrators within the harem. To European observers, the harem was a place of exotic mystery and presumably constant sensual pleasure for the sultan. This is a fantasy that says more about European projections than about Ottoman reality. The harem was also a place of intense political activity. The women of the harem were not passive. The sultan's mother, the Valide Sultan, was one of the most powerful figures in the entire empire, often corresponding directly with foreign ambassadors, managing vast charitable foundations, and actively participating in political decisions. The Sultan's favored concubines, the Hayski, could accumulate enormous influence. The most famous of all harem women was a woman known to history as Roxolana, whose Ottoman name was Hurrem Sultan. She was of uncertain origin, possibly Ukrainian, possibly Polish, taken as a slave and entering the harem as a concubine. She became the favorite of Suleiman, and then something unprecedented. He married her. This was extraordinary. No Ottoman sultan within living memory had formally married a concubine. She became his legal wife, his partner in correspondence, and his most trusted advisor. Hurrem was brilliant, politically astute, and completely devoted to ensuring that her sons would inherit the throne. Her correspondence with Suleiman, which survives, reveals a relationship of genuine tenderness and intellectual partnership. She also managed to destroy the career, and ultimately the life of Suleiman's greatest general and closest friend, Ibrahim Pasha, whom she viewed as a threat to her son's prospects. The exact dynamics of this court intrigue remain somewhat obscure, but the outcome was clear. Ibrahim was strangled in the palace in 1536. The age of Suleiman was also what historians call the Sultanate of Women, a period when female members of the royal family exercised unusual political influence. This influence would continue for generations after Suleiman's death. Chapter 18: The Golden Road to Samarkand. The Ottoman Empire was not only a military and political achievement, it was an economic one. At its height, Ottoman territory controlled the most important trade routes of the known world. The Silk Road from China and Central Asia passed through Persian and Anatolian territories under Ottoman influence before reaching the ports of the Mediterranean. The spice trade from India and Southeast Asia moved through the Red Sea, which the Ottomans controlled, to Egypt and then northward. The overland route from Persia to the Mediterranean moved through Anatolia. The caravanserai network was the nervous system of this economy. These large, comfortable resting places for merchant caravans were built at regular intervals along the main trade routes, typically a day's journey apart. They provided shelter, food, water, and security for merchants and their goods, free of charge for the first 3 days of a stay. They were founded and maintained by pious endowments, the Vakif system, through which wealthy individuals, including sultans and their families, dedicated property and revenue to charitable and public purposes. The bazaars of Istanbul, Cairo, Aleppo, and Damascus were among the most diverse commercial spaces in the world. Venetian merchants traded alongside Persian merchants, Jewish traders alongside Armenian ones, Ottoman Muslims alongside Greek Christians, and Arab merchants from across the empire. The Great Bazaar of Istanbul, the Kapali Çarşı, contained thousands of shops organized by trade, surrounded by hands where wholesale merchants stored and traded their goods. The Ottoman economy was not a free market economy in the modern sense. The state regulated prices, controlled guilds, and maintained a complex system of privileges and restrictions. But within this framework, an enormous variety of economic activity took place, generating wealth for the state through taxation and for individuals through trade. Chapter 19: The Scholars and the Saints. Islamic scholarship flourished under Ottoman patronage. The Medrese schools attached to every major mosque formed an educational system of considerable sophistication. Students who passed through this system studied theology, Islamic law, Arabic language and literature, logic, mathematics, and astronomy. The highest ranks of the ulama, the Muslim scholarly class, were deeply integrated into Ottoman governance. The Sayhul Islam, the chief religious official, issued fatwas, religious opinions on questions of law and policy. The Qadis, judges trained in Islamic law, administered justice across the empire. The relationship between the sultans and the ulama was complex and sometimes tense. The ulama provided religious legitimacy for Ottoman rule, but they also served as a check on arbitrary power, at least in theory. Beyond the formal educational institutions, the Sufi orders, the mystical brotherhoods of Islam, played an enormous role in Ottoman society. The Mevlevi order, followers of the great poet and mystic Rumi, was centered in Konya and spread throughout the empire. Their distinctive practice of sama, the whirling meditation that Europeans called the dance of the whirling dervishes, expressed a theology of divine love and union that coexisted peacefully within Ottoman Sunni Islam. Rumi himself, who had lived in Konya in the 13th century, was one of the greatest poets who ever lived. His Masnavi, a vast poem of spiritual teaching, and his lyric collection, the Divan-i-Kebir, express a vision of divine love so inclusive and so beautiful that they have continued to speak to readers across cultures and centuries. He wrote, "Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right-doing, there is a field. I will meet you there." The Ottoman world was large enough to contain that field, at least some of the time. The Long Afternoon. Chapter 20, After Suleiman. Suleiman died in 1566 on campaign in Hungary. He was 71 years old and had spent much of his reign at war. He died in his tent, and his death was kept secret for several days while the army marched back toward Istanbul so that the campaign would not collapse. His successor was his son Selim II, known unkindly to history as Selim the Sot for his reputed fondness for wine. Selim II was not an incompetent ruler, but he represented a shift that would become characteristic of the later Ottoman period. The Sultan who governed from the palace rather than leading his armies in the field. This shift had significant consequences. Power began to flow away from the Sultan himself toward the Grand Vizier and the palace bureaucracy. The Janissaries, no longer regularly campaigning, became an increasingly politicized and difficult force in Istanbul. Court intrigue grew more elaborate and more consequential. But the empire continued to expand, at least for a while. Cyprus was taken from Venice in 1571. The great naval battle of Lepanto in 1571, in which a Holy League fleet destroyed the Ottoman navy, was presented in Europe as a great Christian victory, and in terms of the number of ships destroyed and men killed it certainly was. But the strategic effect was limited. The Ottomans rebuilt their fleet within 2 years, and the Mediterranean remained broadly under Ottoman dominance. Chapter 21, The Magnificent City. Let us pause from the chronicle of sultans and wars and speak for a moment about Istanbul itself, the city at the center of the world. By the 16th century, Istanbul was the largest city in Europe, perhaps with a population of 700,000 or more. It was built on 7 hills like Rome, and the comparison was deliberate. From the sea, arriving by ship, the skyline was a succession of domes and minarets, punctuated by the Great Dome of the Hagia Sophia, the 6 minarets of the Sultanate Mosque built by Ahmed I in the early 17th century, the elegant cascade of the Suleymaniye, the gardens and pavilions of Topkapi Palace on its promontory above the confluence of the Golden Horn, the Bosphorus, and the Sea of Marmara. Topkapi Palace was not a single building but a complex of courtyards and pavilions built up over generations. The first courtyard was open to the public. The second held the administrative offices of the empire, the divan where the Grand Vizier and the Imperial Council met, the Great Treasury. The third courtyard, entered through the Gate of Felicity, was the Sultan's private world, the throne room, the imperial school, the treasury, the harem. Beyond that lay the fourth courtyard with its gardens and kiosks overlooking the Bosphorus, where sultans could sit in magnificent isolation and watch the ships pass below. The city was organized around its neighborhoods, each with its own character. The Jewish quarter at Balat, the Greek Orthodox neighborhoods of the Fanar district, the Armenian communities, the foreign merchants of Galata across the Golden Horn, the great bazaars, the hands within the hands, The mosques, hundreds of them, their minarets a forest of stone needles puncturing the Istanbul sky. At dawn, the call to prayer rose from all the minarets simultaneously, a sound of extraordinary beauty, each voice slightly different in timing and tone, the overlapping waves of the adhan spreading across the hills in the cool morning light. Chapter 22. The 17th Century, Crisis and Adaptation. The 17th century brought serious challenges to the empire. A severe economic crisis, partly caused by the influx of silver from the Americas that was disrupting trade and currency values across Eurasia, hit the Ottoman economy hard. Military technology was changing rapidly, and the Janissaries, grown conservative and politically powerful, resisted reforms to the military system. Provincial revolts, the Selali rebellions, racked Anatolia. And yet the empire endured, and in some domains thrived. The great Ottoman travel writer Evliya Çelebi set out in the 1630s on a journey that would eventually cover 50 years and most of the known world. His Seyahatname, the Book of Travels, is one of the most extraordinary documents of the early modern period. 10 volumes of observations, stories, jokes, exaggerations, and genuine reportage from every corner of the Ottoman world and beyond. Evliya was funny, curious, self-deprecating, and magnificently unreliable as a source of facts, but supremely valuable as a portrait of a civilization in all its complexity. He wrote about the street food of Istanbul, the wrestlers of Edirne, the coffee houses of Cairo, the pilgrimage routes to Mecca, the Christian monasteries of Mount Athos, the markets of Tabriz. He wrote about ordinary people with the same attentiveness he brought to descriptions of sultans and viziers. He is wonderful company. The coffee house deserves a mention of its own. Coffee had arrived in Istanbul in the 1550s, and coffee houses spread through the city with remarkable speed. By the end of the 16th century, there were hundreds of them. They were places where men of all classes gathered to drink coffee, play chess and backgammon, listen to music and storytelling, debate politics and religion, and simply sit in companionable warmth. The ulama occasionally tried to have them closed, on the grounds that they encouraged idleness and sedition. The sultans occasionally agreed and issued closures. The coffee houses simply reopened. They were too popular, too deeply embedded in urban social life to be suppressed. The Ottoman coffee house is, in some ways, the ancestor of the European coffee house that would become such a significant institution in the 17th and 18th centuries. Ottoman merchants and travelers brought the coffee habit to Venice and Vienna and London and Paris, where it took root and flourished. Chapter 23. Köprülü and the Last Great Expansion. In the 1650s, the empire was in genuine crisis. A weak sultan, financial disorder, Janissary revolts, and naval defeats threatened to tear the state apart. And then a remarkable old man named Köprülü Mehmed Pasha became Grand Vizier. Köprülü was 70 years old when he took office, harsh, ruthless, and completely committed to restoring order. He executed thousands of people, including high officials, in a purge that stabilized the situation through sheer terror. He reformed the finances. He reimposed discipline on the army. He won victories in Transylvania and the Aegean. His son Ahmed Köprülü succeeded him as Grand Vizier and continued his work with more diplomatic skill and somewhat less bloodshed. Under Ahmed, the Ottomans took Crete from Venice in 1669, after a siege that had lasted 24 years. It was one of the longest sieges in history and one of the last major Ottoman conquests. In 1683, the Ottomans made their greatest and final push into the heart of Europe. A massive army, perhaps 150,000 strong, under Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, marched to Vienna and besieged it for 2 months. But Vienna held, and when a relief army of Poles and Austrians and Germans, led by the Polish King Jan Sobieski, arrived and descended from the Kahlenberg Hill in the largest cavalry charge in history, the Ottoman siege collapsed in chaos. Kara Mustafa was executed in Belgrade by order of the Sultan. The era of Ottoman expansion in Europe was definitively over. The years that followed saw Ottoman forces pushed steadily back. Hungary was lost. Transylvania was lost. Greece remained Ottoman but was increasingly restive. The Treaty of Karlovitz in 1699 formalized these losses and forced the Ottomans to confront a new reality. They were no longer the dominant military power in Europe. The Long Decline and its BUTS. Chapter 24. Reform and Resistance. The 18th century brought the Ottoman Empire face to face with the challenge that would define its final 2 centuries, the question of reform. Europe was changing with extraordinary speed. The scientific revolution, the military revolution, the development of professional armies and modern bureaucracies, the beginnings of industrialization. These changes were producing states of increasing military and economic power. The Ottoman Empire, for the first time in its history, found itself falling behind. The response was a series of reform efforts, some more successful than others. Selim III, who came to the throne in 1789, was genuinely committed to military modernization. He established the New Order Army, the Nizam-i-Saidid, trained along European lines. He invited French and other European officers to serve as advisors. He opened new technical schools. But the Janissaries, who saw the new order as a direct threat to their privileges and existence, revolted. Selim was deposed and eventually killed. The reforms were rolled back. Mahmud II, who came to the throne in 1808, was more patient and more ruthless. He spent years building a coalition of support before making his move. In 1826, he provoked the Janissaries into revolt and then destroyed them with artillery. The Janissary Corps, which had been the backbone of the Ottoman military for 5 centuries, was abolished in a single bloody day. Mahmud called it the auspicious incident. With the Janissaries gone, Mahmud began systematic reforms along European lines. A new army was created. New schools were established. Western dress was adopted for officials. The old turban was replaced by the fez. A postal system was created. Roads were improved. A state newspaper was established. These reforms were real and significant, but they were also profoundly disorienting for a society in which tradition and religion were deeply intertwined with political legitimacy. Chapter 25. The Artists and Poets of the Late Empire. Even as the empire contracted politically and militarily, its cultural life continued to produce work of extraordinary beauty. Ottoman classical music reached its heights in the 18th and 19th centuries, producing composers of great sophistication. Ottoman poetry had developed over centuries a complex tradition of divan literature in Persian and Turkish, full of elaborate conventions, extended metaphors, and a vocabulary of love and mysticism that could be simultaneously erotic and spiritual. The art of calligraphy was elevated to a level of refinement that is still astonishing to behold. Ottoman calligraphers spent years learning to control a reed pen with perfect precision, producing inscriptions in the great mosques and on paper and ceramic and stone that are simultaneously writing and visual art of the highest order. The Iznik tiles that decorated the interiors of Ottoman mosques and palaces were produced in the 16th and 17th centuries and reached a level of technical perfection in their cobalt blues and coral reds and clean whites that has never been surpassed. The workshops of Iznik eventually declined as demand fell and quality fell with it, but the tiles they produced remain among the most beautiful ceramic objects ever made. And there was the shadow puppet theater, Karagöz, with its irreverent, comic, slightly subversive humor, its puppet figures representing the different characters and ethnicities of Ottoman society arguing and scheming and falling down and getting up again. Karagöz himself, the hero of the shows, was a crude, clever, good-hearted trickster who always managed to outwit or outlast his more pretentious opponents. The Karagöz shows were performed at Ramadan entertainments and in coffee houses and markets, and their humor was broad enough to reach everyone. Chapter 26. The Tanzimat. The Great Reform period of the 19th century began in 1839 with the promulgation of the Gulhane Edict by Sultan Abdülmecid I. This edict, and the reforming period it inaugurated, called the Tanzimat, meaning reorganization, represented an attempt to modernize the empire along explicitly Western lines while maintaining its Islamic character and its diversity. The Tanzimat reforms were extensive and ambitious. They established the equality of all Ottoman subjects before the law, regardless of religion. They created new secular courts alongside the traditional Islamic courts. They reformed taxation. They opened new secular schools. They established a telegraph network, a railway system, a postal service. They created a system of provincial governance modeled on French administrative practice. The effects were profound and contradictory. On one hand, the non-Muslim minorities of the empire, the Greeks, Armenians, Jews, and various other communities, gained legal protections and opportunities they had not previously enjoyed. Vibrant presses in Greek, Armenian, and Ladino flourished alongside Ottoman, Turkish, and Arabic publications. New theaters and opera houses opened in Istanbul. European fashions and habits spread among the educated classes. On the other hand, the reforms generated powerful resistance from conservative religious and social forces who saw them as an attack on the Islamic character of the state. And they produced paradoxes. Reforms intended to create equal citizens of a shared empire sometimes sharpened ethnic and religious identities rather than softening them, as different communities used their new freedoms to organize along communal lines. The empire in the late 19th century was an extraordinary cultural space. Istanbul, in particular, was a city of remarkable intellectual and artistic vitality. Ottoman Turkish writers were experimenting with new literary forms imported from Europe, the novel, the short story, the newspaper column, and trying to reconcile them with their own tradition. Poets were debating whether to continue writing in the elaborate classical style or to adopt simpler language that could reach a broader public. Chapter 27. The Great Powers and the Eastern Question. The great powers of Europe watched the Ottoman Empire's troubles with a mixture of concern, calculation, and appetite. The Eastern Question, as diplomats called it, was essentially the problem of what would happen when the Ottoman Empire finally collapsed. The Ottoman state itself was sometimes called the sick man of Europe, a phrase attributed to Tsar Nicholas I of Russia, who used it in the 1850s. The term captured something real. The empire was weakening, losing territory, struggling to reform itself fast enough to keep pace with European military and economic power. Russia, which shared a long border with the empire and had fought multiple wars with it, wanted access to the warm water ports of the Black Sea and the straits connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Britain wanted to prevent Russian expansion and maintain access to India through the Middle East. Austria-Hungary was concerned about Balkan stability. France had traditional interests in the Levant and in protecting Catholic populations within the empire. These competing interests meant that the great powers sometimes propped the empire up, as when Britain and France fought alongside the Ottomans against Russia in the Crimean War of 1853 to 1856, and sometimes dismembered it when it suited their interests. Greece had won its independence in 1821 to 1832, supported by Britain, France, and Russia, and to a considerable extent by the romantic imagination of European liberals who saw in the Greek struggle a revival of classical antiquity. Byron died at Missolonghi in 1824, trying to help the Greek cause, and became one of history's most famous martyrs to a political ideal. Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, and Montenegro gained various degrees of autonomy or independence over the course of the 19th century, through a combination of internal uprising and external support. Each loss was painful, both practically and symbolically. The empire that had once seemed boundless was being reduced, decade by decade, to a smaller and smaller territory. The final chapter. Chapter 28. Abdulhamid and the Red Sultan. Abdulhamid II came to the throne in 1876, and he would reign for 33 years, the longest reign of any sultan since Suleiman. He was a deeply complex figure, intelligent, suspicious, genuinely reforming in some areas and brutally repressive in others. Abdulhamid promoted a policy of pan-Islamism, presenting himself as the caliph and protector of Muslims worldwide. He used the new telegraph network to communicate with Muslim communities across Asia and Africa, building a sense of Islamic solidarity that had propaganda and diplomatic uses. He also presided over massacres. The Hamidian massacres of Armenians in the 1890s, in which perhaps 100,000 to 300,000 Armenians were killed in eastern Anatolia, were either ordered by Abdulhamid or tacitly permitted by him. The massacres were triggered by Armenian nationalist activity and Ottoman fears of Russian exploitation of Armenian discontent. But the scale of the violence went far beyond any legitimate security concern. European governments protested, but took no effective action. Abdulhamid was also deeply afraid of his own educated subjects. He maintained an extensive secret police network. He censored newspapers, banned books, monitored telegrams. He lived in terror of assassination, rarely leaving his palace at Yildiz. And yet under his reign, railways were built, schools were opened, the university expanded. The Hijaz Railway, connecting Damascus to Medina, was built partly as a service to pilgrims and partly as a strategic asset. Istanbul's first electric trams ran during his reign. In 1908, a revolution. The Committee of Union and Progress, known to Europeans as the Young Turks, led by officers and intellectuals who had been organizing in secret for years, staged an uprising. Abdulhamid briefly accepted a constitution. Then he tried to organize a counter-coup. It failed, and in 1909 he was deposed and sent into exile in Thessaloniki. He died in 1918. Chapter 29. The Young Turks in the Last Wars. The Committee of Union and Progress, the CUP that effectively governed the empire after 1908, was a complicated organization. Its leaders were young, energetic, patriotic, and genuinely committed to modernizing the empire. They were also, in many cases, paranoid, authoritarian, and willing to use extreme violence to achieve their goals. The years between 1908 and 1918 were ones of almost continuous catastrophe. Italy invaded Libya in 1911. The Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 were a disaster of the first order. The Ottoman army was defeated by a coalition of Balkan states and lost almost all its remaining European territory in weeks. Edirne, the second capital, fell to the Bulgarians. The shock in Istanbul was profound. The CUP leadership drew from these disasters a conclusion that would prove catastrophic: that the empire's non-Muslim minorities, and particularly its Armenians, represented a fifth column that had to be eliminated. The Armenian genocide of 1915 to 1916 was one of the great crimes of the 20th century. Approximately 1 to 1.5 million Armenians were killed, massacred, starved, force-marched through the Syrian desert. Entire communities that had existed in eastern Anatolia for millennia were annihilated. The event remains deeply contested politically, particularly by the Turkish state, but the historical evidence for its deliberate, systematic nature is overwhelming. The CUP had also made a fateful decision: to enter the First World War on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary. It was a gamble that failed completely. The Ottoman army fought with considerable courage in several theaters, most famously at Gallipoli in 1915, where Mustafa Kemal, a young colonel who would later remake the Turkish state, led a successful defense against a British and Anzac landing. But overall, the war went badly. The Arab Revolt, supported by Britain and romanticized by T.E. Lawrence, undermined Ottoman control of the Arab provinces. British forces took Baghdad and then Jerusalem. By 1918, the empire was exhausted and collapsing. The armistice was signed in October 1918. The Cup leaders fled on a German submarine. Allied forces occupied Istanbul. The empire that had lasted 6 centuries was, for all practical purposes, over. Chapter 30. Mustafa Kemal and the Republic. But the story of the Ottoman people was not over, even if the story of the Ottoman Empire was. In 1919, a Turkish general named Mustafa Kemal landed at Samsun on the Black Sea coast and began organizing resistance against the Allied occupation and against the Greek military invasion of Western Anatolia that the Allies had permitted. The War of Independence that followed lasted until 1923 and resulted in the expulsion of Greek forces, the establishment of a new Turkish state, and a massive population exchange between Turkey and Greece that uprooted more than 1 million people from homes their families had occupied for generations. In 1923, Mustafa Kemal proclaimed the Republic of Turkey and became its first president. He would later be given the surname Ataturk, father of the Turks. Ataturk's revolution was radical and comprehensive. The Sultanate was abolished in 1922, the Caliphate in 1924. The religious courts were replaced by a secular civil code based on Swiss law. The Arabic script in which Turkish had been written for centuries was replaced by a Latin alphabet. The fez was banned. Religious education was restricted. Women were given the right to vote. The Ottoman Empire had not simply ended. It had been deliberately, systematically dismantled and replaced by something new, a secular, national Turkish republic. 6 centuries of history were officially closed. The legacy. Chapter 31. What remained? And yet the Ottoman Empire did not simply disappear. It left behind an inheritance so vast and so deeply embedded in the landscapes and cultures it had shaped that traces of it persist to this day. The physical landscape of the former Ottoman world is full of Ottoman presence. The mosques and hands and bridges and aqueducts built by Sinan and his successors stand in Istanbul, in Edirne, in Sarajevo, in Cairo, in Jerusalem, in Damascus, in Aleppo, in cities across what was once the empire. The Great Mostar Bridge in Bosnia, blown up in the Balkan Wars of the 1990s and meticulously restored, is an Ottoman bridge. The bazaars of Istanbul and Cairo and Aleppo, however battered by time, follow the organizational logic of Ottoman commercial space. The food, the extraordinary food culture of Turkey and of the broader region, carries deep Ottoman roots. Baklava and lokum and kaymekli ekmek kadyafi were palace foods before they were street foods. The kebab in its many variations, the pilavs, the stuffed vegetables, the cold yogurt soups, the coffee, the tea, the elaborate meze tradition of small dishes that begins a proper meal and that can, if you are not careful, become the entire meal. The languages. Ottoman Turkish, the administrative and literary language of the empire, contributed thousands of words to the languages of the Balkans, the Middle East, and Central Asia. Arabic, Persian, and Ottoman Turkish were so thoroughly intertwined in the high culture of the empire that separating them is like trying to separate threads from a woven fabric. The political and administrative traditions. The countries that emerged from the former Ottoman territories inherited not only the geographic framework of Ottoman provincial administration, but also many of its political habits. The strong central state, the bureaucratic tradition, the relationship between religious authority and political power. These inheritances are visible, though transformed, in the political cultures of Turkey, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, Israel and Palestine, Saudi Arabia and the Balkans. Chapter 32. The Millet System and its Legacy. One of the most interesting Ottoman institutions was the millet system, the framework for governing the empire's non-Muslim communities. The word millet comes from the Arabic millah, meaning nation or community, and in Ottoman practice it referred to the legally recognized religious communities. The Greek Orthodox Christians, the Armenian Christians, the Jews, the Catholics. Each millet was allowed to govern itself according to its own religious law in personal matters: marriage, divorce, inheritance, religious education. Each had its own religious leadership: the patriarch for the Orthodox, the chief rabbi for the Jews, that was responsible to the Ottoman state for the community's behavior and tax payments. This was not equality in the modern sense. Non-Muslims paid higher taxes. They were restricted in various ways, prohibited from riding horses in some periods, restricted in what they could wear or build. The system was explicitly hierarchical, with Muslims at the top. But it was also a form of managed pluralism that allowed multiple religious communities to coexist, often in the same city and sometimes in the same street, for centuries. The Greek Orthodox community of Istanbul maintained its patriarchate continuously from Byzantine times through the Ottoman period and into the modern era. The Jewish community of Istanbul, swelled by the refugees expelled from Spain in 1492, who were welcomed by Sultan Bayezid II, maintained its Ladino language and culture for 5 centuries. The millet system's legacy is complex. It created the infrastructure of communal identity that made certain communities resilient and culturally productive. It also made it difficult to create a sense of common Ottoman citizenship, because identity was organized primarily along religious communal rather than political lines. When nationalist ideologies arrived in the 19th century, the millet communities provided ready-made organizations for nationalist mobilization, but at the cost of the Ottoman pluralism that had, however imperfectly, held them together. Chapter 33: Voices from the Ottoman World. History is not only the story of sultans and battles, it is also the story of ordinary voices, most of which have been lost, but some survive. The poet Fuzuli, who lived in the 16th century and wrote in Azerbaijani Turkish, Persian, and Arabic, produced lyric poetry of heartbreaking beauty. His Layla and Majnun, a retelling of the great Arabic love story, is a masterpiece of Ottoman literary art. He wrote from Baghdad, a city that passed between Ottoman and Safavid control multiple times in his lifetime, and his poetry carries the weight of that turbulence even when it is speaking of love and longing. The poet Baki, a contemporary of Suleiman, wrote an elegy on Suleiman's death that is considered one of the finest poems in the Ottoman language. It is a poem about grief and impermanence, about the fact that even the greatest rulers are subject to time. The female poet Mihri Hatun, who lived in the late 15th century, wrote love poetry of remarkable directness and skill, challenging the conventions that restricted women's expression. She is one of the few female voices we have from the early Ottoman literary tradition. The architect Sinan left behind his autobiography, the Tezkir Tolbunyan, a record of his buildings and the thought that went into them, one of the rare first-person accounts of artistic creation from the Ottoman world. Evliya Celebi, whom we have already met, left behind his extraordinary book of travels, full of the sounds and smells and textures of the Ottoman world. The cry of coffee sellers in the bazaars, the music of Ramadan nights, the taste of cherries from the orchards of Bursa, the sound of the Bosphorus at night. These voices are fragments. They are not the whole story, but they are precious, and they remind us that behind the political narrative, there were millions of lives being lived in all their complexity and richness and ordinary human texture. Chapter 34: The Empire and Its Others. No honest account of the Ottoman Empire can omit its shadow side. The empire was sustained by slavery. Not only the Devshirme system, which was a particular form of servitude with its own complex characteristics, but also by the large-scale enslavement of Africans, Circassians, and others, who worked as domestic servants, concubines, and in some cases in more brutal conditions. The slave trade was an integral part of the Ottoman economy, and the abolition of slavery, which came late in the 19th century under European pressure, was deeply contested. The empire was maintained by violence. Rebellions were suppressed with considerable brutality. Taxation was enforced by coercion. The treatment of subject populations, particularly non-Muslim ones, varied enormously depending on time and place and local conditions, ranging from genuine tolerance to extortion and persecution. The empire's final decades were marked by a series of atrocities: the Hamidian massacres of Armenians, the ethnic cleansing during the Balkan Wars, the Armenian genocide of 1915, the various massacres and forced migrations that accompanied the collapse of empire. These were not aberrations in an otherwise peaceful story. They were symptoms of what happens when a complex, multi-ethnic, multi-religious political structure begins to fragment under the pressure of nationalism and war. History demands honesty about all of this. The Ottoman Empire was neither the exotic Oriental paradise of European fantasy, nor the irredeemably cruel despotism of European propaganda. It was a human institution, capable of extraordinary achievement and terrible cruelty, of great beauty and great violence, of remarkable tolerance and brutal repression, sometimes simultaneously. Chapter 35: Ruins and Memories. Let us end not with a verdict, but with an image. Somewhere in eastern Anatolia, on a hillside overlooking a valley that in spring fills with wildflowers, there are the ruins of an Armenian church. The walls are still standing, at least in part. The stone is old and deeply weathered, carved with crosses and vines, and the faces of saints that have been worn by centuries of wind and rain into something abstract, something almost unrecognizable. The church was built in the medieval period, long before the Ottomans arrived. It was maintained and used by an Armenian community for centuries under Ottoman rule. It was abandoned in 1915. No one uses it now. The village that surrounded it is gone. The people who built it, who prayed in it, who celebrated their births and marriages and deaths in it, are scattered or dead. And yet the walls stand. The carved stone remains, however weathered. The valley below is beautiful in spring. The wind moves through the ruined windows and makes a sound that might be anything. This is what empires leave behind: ruins and memories, buildings and stories, languages and foods and genes, the invisible architecture of habits and assumptions that shapes the way people see the world even when they no longer know where those habits came from. The Ottoman Empire is gone, but it left its mark on the world so deeply that we are still, centuries later, living inside its legacy, even when we do not know it. Epilogue: The waters of the Bosphorus. Let us return at the end to water. The Bosphorus, the narrow strait that divides Europe from Asia, flows through the heart of Istanbul. In the morning before the city wakes, the water is dark and quiet, reflecting the lights on both shores. Fishing boats move slowly across the surface. A cargo ship passes in the channel, heading for the Black Sea or returning from it, its lights blinking in the pre-dawn dark. This strait has been crossed by armies and merchants and pilgrims and refugees for 3,000 years. The Argonauts sailed through it, in myth. The Persian armies of Darius and Xerxes crossed it on bridges of boats. Constantine built his city overlooking it. Maimed conquered that city and looked out over these same waters from Topkapi Palace, watching the ships and dreaming of whatever sultan's dream. Now the ships are different, and the city has grown beyond all recognition, spreading over hills that were once forests and fields. The bridges that span the strait are feats of modern engineering. The noise and light of a metropolis of 15 million people fills the air. But the water is the same water. The Bosphorus flows as it always has, from the Black Sea to the Sea of Marmara, cold and swift and slightly luminous at night, connecting and dividing, carrying everything and remembering nothing. History is always like this. The places endure and the people change, and then the people endure and the places change, and through all of it the water keeps flowing, indifferent to empires, patient as time. Close your eyes. You are on a ship on the Bosphorus in some year you cannot quite identify. The water is dark and smooth. The lights on both shores are very far away. The air is cool and smells of salt. The ship moves slowly, barely making a ripple. Ahead of you is the Sea of Marmara, its surface open and glittering. Beyond that, the Dardanelles, and beyond that, the Aegean, and beyond that, the whole wide Mediterranean, blue and ancient and full of stories. Behind you is the Black Sea, dark as its name, its depths full of things no light has ever reached. You are passing through the middle of everything. The continent changes on either side of you, from Europe to Asia and back again, and it does not matter which side is which, because you are on the water between both, belonging to neither and to both. The ship moves, the water slides past, the lights recede. Somewhere very far away, a mosque is beginning its call to prayer. The sound travels across the water, rises and falls, and then is gone. The stars are very bright out here. The water is very calm. You are very tired. And the Ottoman Empire, 600 years of it, all its magnificence and its violence, its art and its wars, its sultans and its poets and its merchants and its slaves and its holy men and its ordinary people getting through their ordinary days, all of it is settling around you now like a great and gentle dust, like snow falling on a still sea, like the end of a long day that was full of everything. Rest now. The empire is over. The water is here. Sleep. A note on sources and further reading. The Ottoman Empire is richly documented, and there is a wealth of scholarship available for those who wish to go deeper. For a comprehensive overview, Caroline Finkel's Osman's Dream is widely considered one of the best single-volume histories of the empire. Jason Goodwin's Lords of the Horizons offers a more impressionistic but beautifully written portrait. For the early period, Heath Laurie's work on the nature of the early Ottoman state is essential. For Suleiman and his age, Leslie Pearce's The Imperial Harem offers a revisionist and compelling account of the role of women in Ottoman politics. For the later empire, Donald Quadert's work on economic history and Eugene Rogan's The Arabs provide essential context. Evliya Celebi's Sayahatnam, portions of which have been translated into English, is essential and endlessly entertaining primary reading. For art and architecture, the work of Gulru Nesipoglu on Sinan and on Ottoman architectural culture is authoritative. For literature, Walter Andrews and his collaborators have produced important translations and studies of Ottoman poetry. The story of the end of the empire and the beginning of the Turkish Republic is told brilliantly in Eric Jan Zurcher's Turkey, A Modern History. And for the human texture of Ottoman life, in all its richness and complexity, there is no better guide than Orhan Pamuk, the Istanbul novelist and Nobel laureate, whose memoir Istanbul, Memories and the City captures something essential about living in the shadow of this extraordinary history.